I had to replay the clip 3 times because I could not believe what I was hearing. The room on television looked like every other election night studio at first. Bright lights, confident smiles, analysts leaning back in their chairs as if the ending had already been written. Texas was supposed to be predictable. Texas was supposed to be safe. And yet, within minutes, the mood cracked like glass. My phone started vibrating like it had a pulse of its own. Notifications stacked on top of each other so fast I could barely read them. Headlines, screenshots, panic, celebration, confusion. The kind of digital chaos that only happens when something political and enormous has just shattered the script everyone thought they understood. Then the clip appeared, a leaked reaction, raw and unfiltered. The former president, furious, voice raised, disbelief pouring out in sharp bursts. Not the confident rally tone people were used to hearing, but something rougher, angrier. The sound of a political titan realizing the ground beneath him had shifted. Commentators started scrambling in real time. One network cut to another panel. Another host stared silently at a screen full of numbers that suddenly looked very different from what the campaigns had predicted. It felt like the entire political world had leaned forward at the exact same moment. Because this was Texas. For years, the state had been described like an unbreakable fortress for the MAGA movement. A place where endorsements carried enormous weight and victories were expected to roll in like clockwork. But on this night, the numbers crawling across the bottom of the screen told a completely different story. District after district began slipping away. You could almost hear the collective gasp moving across the country. Supporters refreshing their feeds, critics posting stunned reactions, pundits trying to figure out whether they were witnessing a temporary stumble or the beginning of something much bigger. And standing at the center of that storm was the man whose influence had defined an entire era of Republican politics. The anger, the disbelief, the sense that something historic had just cracked open. But to understand why this moment hit like a political bomb, we need to rewind a few weeks, because what was building in Texas was something almost nobody saw coming. And the deeper you look, the more impossible it seems, until the final numbers start whispering a different future entirely. To understand why that moment felt like an earthquake, you have to understand what Texas represents in American politics. Texas isn't just another state on the electoral map. For decades, it has been treated like the crown jewel of conservative power, a place where political movements prove their strength and where reputations are either forged in steel or shattered in front of the entire country. And for the MAGA movement, Texas was supposed to be the ultimate confirmation. For weeks leading up to the election, the narrative was almost impossibly confident. Every rally, every television appearance, every campaign ad carried the same underlying message. This was going to be a victory lap, a demonstration of political dominance, a reminder that the influence of the man who reshaped the Republican Party was still as powerful as ever. You could hear it in the speeches, crowds packed into arenas under massive flags, music blasting, supporters chanting with the kind of energy that only comes when people feel absolutely certain they're on the winning side of history. And then the candidate would step onto the stage, microphone in hand, promising the same thing again and again. Victory. Total victory. Political commentators on conservative networks echoed the same certainty night after night. Panels of strategists spoke with the calm confidence of people who believed the ending had already been written. Poll numbers were interpreted as proof. Fundraising totals were framed as unstoppable momentum. Some pundits even started talking about the race like it wasn't really a race at all. The message was clear, one analyst said during a primetime segment that quickly spread across social media. This is supposed to be a coronation, not a contest. And if you scrolled through political Twitter during those weeks, the predictions came pouring in. Influencers posting confident threads, commentators declaring the state locked down, viral tweets boasting that the results would prove once again that Trump's endorsement was the most powerful force in Republican politics. "Landslide incoming," one post read. "Texas isn't even close," another predicted. Even critics of the movement seemed resigned to the same conclusion. They debated the margins, argued about turnout, speculated about long-term demographic changes. But in the short term, many assumed the outcome was already baked into the system. Because Texas had a reputation, and reputations can be powerful things. Campaign insiders walked through hallways with the relaxed posture of people who believed they were about to win big. Political donors appeared on television, smiling comfortably. The rallies got bigger, the speeches louder, the predictions bolder. Confidence slowly turned into something else, something sharper. Something that, to outsiders watching carefully, started to sound a lot like arrogance. But here's the strange thing about politics. Sometimes the louder the victory speeches become, the quieter the warning signs grow. And beneath all the noise of campaign rallies and television predictions, something else was beginning to stir. Small shifts, quiet frustrations, communities organizing in ways that didn't make the evening news. At first, almost nobody seemed to notice. But behind the scenes, cracks were already forming, and the man at the center of it all might not have realized the storm heading straight for him. For years, one name towered over Republican politics like a thundercloud that could roll in and change the weather overnight. Donald Trump was not just a candidate or a former president. He was the gravitational center of an entire political movement. His endorsement carried a strange, almost mythical reputation. In primary after primary, a single rally appearance or late-night statement could lift unknown candidates from obscurity and send seasoned politicians scrambling for cover. Campaign consultants spoke about it like political magic, the golden stamp that could transform a race overnight. For years, that image was carefully cultivated. Cable news panels repeated the same storyline. Trump endorses candidate, candidate wins. The narrative grew larger than the evidence itself. Soon it felt like inevitability, like gravity, like something no challenger could escape. But politics has a way of whispering before it shouts, and if you listened closely, the whispers had already begun. A few endorsed candidates quietly lost primaries. Some conservative commentators started asking uncomfortable questions. Was the magic fading? Were voters growing tired of the endless drama? At first, those doubts lived only in cautious op-eds and late-night strategy meetings. Analysts spoke in careful tones, choosing their words like surgeons handling something fragile. Nobody wanted to say it out loud, but the possibility hovered in the air. The rallies still looked massive, the cheers still shook the arenas. Television cameras kept capturing the same triumphant images, waving flags, roaring crowds, confident speeches declaring that the movement was stronger than ever. But somewhere beneath the spectacle, another story was slowly forming. Voters who once thrilled at the chaos were starting to look for something steadier, something quieter, something that felt less like permanent combat and more like governing. You could see hints of it in smaller interviews where veteran strategists paused a little longer before answering questions. You could hear it when certain conservative hosts admitted the map might be tightening just a bit. Still, the public performance never wavered. Confidence stayed front and center. The cameras rolled, the speeches soared, and supporters repeated the same promise again and again. Until election night arrived, and the quiet doubts finally met the only judge that matters in American politics, the voters. And when the first numbers appeared on the screen, the room began to shift, slowly, quietly, almost imperceptibly, because the unexpected was beginning to unfold in real time before anyone. But every political story has another side. And in Texas, that side didn't belong to a single hero stepping onto a stage. It belonged to thousands of ordinary people who rarely appear on television screens, teachers finishing long days and then knocking on doors, college students organizing voter registration tables between classes, Community leaders hosting quiet meetings in libraries, churches, and neighborhood centers. None of it looked dramatic from the outside. There were no giant arenas, no roaring crowds, no viral speeches lighting up cable news. But something real was happening. Texas had been changing for years, slowly and steadily, the way a coastline changes long before anyone notices the tide. New communities were growing. Young voters were reaching the age where politics suddenly felt personal. Families who had once stayed on the sidelines were beginning to believe their voices might actually matter. Grassroots organizers understood something that political insiders sometimes forget. Power doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it builds quietly in phone calls, in volunteer shifts, in conversations between neighbors who decide that this time they are going to show up. And across Texas, those conversations were multiplying. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud. But beneath the surface, a different kind of coalition was forming. Immigrant families proud of the lives they had built. Young voters energized by issues that felt urgent to their future. Long-time residents who simply wanted a political climate that felt less like constant warfare. They weren't thinking about headlines. They weren't thinking about television narratives. They were thinking about ballots. Slowly, almost invisibly, that quiet energy began to translate into something measurable. New registrations, packed early voting locations, lines that stretched farther than campaign strategists expected. Still, most of the political establishment barely noticed, because the loudest voices were still dominating the conversation. But when election night finally arrived, the numbers began appearing one by one, and suddenly they were telling a story nobody in Trump's circle wanted to hear. Election night always has its own electricity, but that night in Texas felt different from the very beginning. Newsrooms across the country were glowing like command centers, giant screens lit up with maps and vote trackers, analysts leaning forward in their chairs while producers whispered instructions through headsets. At first, everything looked routine. Early numbers began rolling in, and the tone on several networks carried that familiar confidence. Anchors spoke calmly, explaining turnout patterns, repeating expectations that the races would fall into their usual lanes. Campaign headquarters for the MAGA-backed candidates were celebrating early returns, supporters cheering whenever another small batch of votes appeared on the screen. But then something subtle began to shift. One district reported numbers that looked tighter than expected. An analyst frowned slightly and refreshed his tablet. Another county posted results that showed a surprising surge in turnout. Suddenly, the conversation on television started slowing down, like commentators were recalculating the story in real time. Phones began buzzing in campaign offices. Staffers gathered in small clusters, whispering urgently while staring at laptops. Advisors who had spent weeks projecting confidence were now leaning over spreadsheets, refreshing county data again and again. Back in the studios, the anchors kept talking, but their tone had changed. The calm certainty from earlier in the evening was fading. One panelist pointed at a district on the screen and quietly noted that the margin there was shrinking much faster than expected. The room grew quieter. Another batch of results dropped, and this time a district actually flipped. For a moment, there was a strange pause on live television, the kind that only happens when reality interrupts the script. One commentator cleared his throat. Another stared at the numbers as if they might change if he looked long enough. Across social media, the reactions exploded instantly, but the real tension was building somewhere else entirely, inside the circles closest to the former president, where allies watching those same numbers were beginning to realize that something deeply unexpected might be unfolding. And then came the moment that completely changed the mood inside Trump's camp. So when you step back and look at the whole story, it almost feels cinematic. A movement that once looked unstoppable, suddenly facing a moment of shock. A political giant reacting with fury as the numbers refused to cooperate. And beneath it all, something quieter but far more powerful shaping the outcome. Voters. Ordinary people who decided that their voice mattered enough to show up. That's the part of this story that sticks with me the most. Political narratives can feel permanent when you're watching them unfold on television. Commentators talk like the future is already written. Campaigns act like momentum can never be broken. But history has a way of surprising everyone. I'd love to hear what you think about this moment, so drop your perspective in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into the stories shaping American politics, make sure you subscribe and join this conversation with us. Because moments like this remind us of something powerful. In a democracy, the loudest voice isn't always the one with the biggest microphone. It's the one that shows up on election day.